So, Nick, welcome to the channel. And roughly over a year ago now, I think about a year, 3 or 4 months or something like that, you and I spoke about AI for the podcast, for the Photographic Life podcast. And we spoke
We
about
did.
it. Yeah, at the time, it was the conversation, wasn't it?
It was. Well, and it still is, to be honest.
Well, you say that. However, I've got a theory, and my theory is this: that after that initial kind of excitement everyone had because AI pictures were winning competitions and suddenly it was in the news,
Yeah.
I get the feeling that it's moved into kind of dark rooms and corridors and it's being spoken about, but it's not quite so headline as it once was. But I also know that you've been doing a huge amount of work from a political perspective. So, what's happened over the last year? I mean, I know that's quite a big question, but
That
what do
is
you
quite a big
think?
question. Okay, well, we can break that down into different sort of components, if you like. So I suppose we can start with the technology itself, which over the past year has developed a little bit, but not really very much because it was never going to be able to progress much further down the avenue that the tech developers had started on. If you understand, or if anybody understands about the actual technical process of generative AI, whether it's text to image, text to text, text to video, text to audio, etc., and knowing the vast amounts of data that are required for input training before one can then put in a prompt to generate an output, you can understand that it's predicated on a finite set of resources. If there isn't something in the training data set that can be that's referred to by a prompt, then that prompt will fail. And that process has not changed. That technology has stayed the same. So the fundamental flaws that were present when we spoke about generative AI programs are still there. The sophistication of the renders and the outputs is slightly improved because they've thrown a lot more computing resources at it, which in itself is an interesting avenue to explore because it's probably even more resource hungry than it was when we were talking about it initially. I mean, there's a huge environmental impact that doesn't really get spoken about a great deal. But as you said, the idea that it's sort of been pushed into dark rooms and corridors and is kind of, a little more in the background, I think is true. And that's worrying from the perspective that the technology is still pretty flaky. It's still anybody that's played with a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or any of those kind of programs will know how easy it is to generate an output that is false. The AI community like to call them hallucinations, which is a way of anthropomorphizing the whole sort of the whole technology and encouraging us to think about it in a sort of a warm, friendly human way. But it's not. It's a statistics-based pattern predictor. That's all it is. A very sophisticated form of autocorrect, if you like, and that's regardless of the output that one is trying to generate, whether it's a piece of text, a bit of video, a song, or a piece of music, or an image.
So,
So
so has it reached a point at which, when it did that original scrape, it's kind of now hungry, like a monster hungry for more before it can go on? Is that where we
there's
are?
a there's a yeah there's a it's there's a curve of diminishing returns, if you like. So in order to generate greater sophistication in the refinement of the output, one needs commensurately greater volumes of data in order to train that algorithm, that model on. And of course, there's only so much stuff out there. So what's happening now is that, I mean, the training processes take place on a regular basis. There's a sort of a big initial training of, I'm sure everybody is familiar with one of the biggest data sets. Well, there are two that people will know. There's the Common Crawl, which is something that Google do on a regular basis. I think there's a monthly sort of Common Crawl data set that you can get access to, which is basically Google's bots looking at all of the kind of stuff that's published online and referencing that. So it's got data points in there. And the other one that people will know about is the Leon 5B data set, which was the image data set that was originally used by Midjourney and by stable diffusion as the basis on which those models were trained. That initial training process is then supplemented with additional training on top of that, which happens on a relatively regular basis. The issue being now, of course, is that all of the generative AI outputs are now being included in those training data sets, including any inaccuracies. If you think about images of humans with 6 or 7 fingers, for example, clearly we know that can happen in real life. People do have those kind of idiosyncratic physiologies, but that's not a regular occurrence. But at one point, those kind of things were being spat out regularly from generative AI platforms, and they will be included in those kind of training data sets. So it's almost like it's poisoning itself. It's being fed its own outputs, which contain inaccuracies and bias and stereotype and all the stuff that I think we probably have spoken about previously, all of which still exists. So in some ways, that's worse, because that additional sort of there's a phrase that is being used a lot by people, which I quite like, which is AI slop, which is I think a good way of describing that sort of unthinking, just content for content's sake output derivative of all the training data. It's filler, isn't it? It's not got any. It's devoid of context. It's devoid of a proper sort of visual language and a series of sort of, we could talk about semiotics, or we could talk about codes and all of that kind of stuff. It's not made with skill. It's just made on the basis of somebody bashing a few words in, and however many times they have to do that. I was in a conversation on LinkedIn recently with somebody who was claiming to be an artist because they'd spent something like, they'd done 500 prompts or something to get what they wanted. And I simply said, well, if you're doing it, that's akin to just sitting at a one-armed bandit doing that 500 times until you get a jackpot. If you can't, there's no sort of refined, it's not like crafting an image where you have an idea, you pre-visualize it, you build the components in, you bring your own emotion, experience, wisdom, knowledge, context, how you feel on the day that you're building that thing. All of that comes to bear on that piece of work that you then sort of present to an audience, and that's completely devoid when you're generating AI outputs.
Yeah, so that raises two things for me. One is that, yes, I'm seeing a lot of people saying, kind of, photographers, get over yourselves. This is the future. We are artists, and we're working with light and we're working with concepts. Well, yeah, that's nothing new. That, what
No,
you're describing is photography. So please don't sort of try and sell that to me as being the new future.
indeed,
Um,
yeah.
but also it does raise this issue, which is, if that's the situation, from what you're describing, AI is kind of eating itself.
I think so. Yeah, it's interesting when one looks at the finances that underpin all of this kind of activity as well. There are a number of tech firms, which we all know, which have massive market capitalizations at the moment, and I think there is a real agenda of those businesses to maintain that sort of market cap, and to generate as much sort of venture capital investment as they can. And when you look at the people that are investing in those businesses, it's people investing in each other's businesses on the basis of, well, we'll lend you the resources to provide for computing, which it will value at, let's say, $3 billion, which you can add to your market cap, and that will, but it's not actually a real transfer of funds. So it's an artificially inflated market sector.
So
That
are we like for those of us old enough to remember, is this dot-com boom?
I think it's very akin to it. It's definitely akin to a Ponzi scheme, that kind of pyramid selling idea. And I think whilst the bubble for .com, I think that was a fairly rapid deceleration. The bubble burst, and there was a rapid downturn in the fortunes in that particular sector. I think with generative AI, we're more likely to see it deflate slowly. as people sort of wake up to the fact that, we don't really enjoy engaging with content that is purely generative AI. And I say purely because I think there is a place, I don't want to be binary about this. I don't want to say all generative AI output is bad,
No.
all human authored content is good, because that paints a very overly simplistic picture. And actually there are many shades of grey that exist in the middle. Um, and I think the reality is and will be that we as creators, authors, photographers, image makers, writers, poets, whatever, will use tools that have that type of technology in to support the kind of work that we do in some way. And one
So,
way that I do know that photographers are using it, which might be interesting, is where they're building their own algorithm based purely on their work. So it's not referencing an external training data set that's been assimilated without permission, which is a copyright infringement. I mean, there are loads of cases being litigated at the moment on that basis, that simply hoovering up somebody's creative content and using it as training for commercial purposes is copyright infringement. I mean, I think that is a given. People generally are now saying, yes, that is copyright infringement.
well,
Proving it is
that
difficult, but
copyright thing is a big part of it, isn't it? I mean,
yeah,
that's why everybody got super kind of wound up about it at the beginning. But I
yes.
wonder, why would a photographer go all, I'm going to be old school about this and play devil's advocate. Why would a photographer be going to the trouble of writing algorithms around their own work? What's the benefit there for a photographer?
I think, well, I don't know if they would be able to write the algorithm, or whether they'd pay a web dev to code an algorithm that did that kind of thing, or whether one can access an open source platform to do this kind of thing. I mean, I haven't explored that in any more detail, but I think I do know of people who are working in this way, and I think it might be interesting, because if you're training it on your own work and there's nothing else that's being involved, it's a closed loop system. So you are potentially able to explore other visual ideas through the sort of the synthesis of the images that you are putting into that training data, and then based on words that you might use to sort of as part of your prompt, which would be based on the themes that you're exploring, based on the sort of the language that you're trying to deal with, or the messaging that you're trying to communicate. So that might output something that particular creative hadn't thought about or hadn't thought of. Now, whether they use that in its own right, or whether then that provides almost like a scrapbook for them to go off and make work themselves in that particular way, I don't know. I mean, it could work in both ways, I guess. I think that where you take a generative AI output and then you work on that yourself in a more traditional digital retouching sense. And I think that can, I mean, that's another grey area as well, where at some point it stops being purely generative AI, of course, and it becomes something that has got a level of human, a human touch on it, if you like.
Yeah, but oh goodness me, I'm always so open to new things and I always want to explore new things, but age and cynicism have both crept up on me. And when I hear you talking about that, I'm instantly taken back to the days, what, I suppose 25 odd years ago, when photographers decided they were going to be syndication agencies and they invested in huge amounts of money spending on scanning machines and so.
Yeah.
And they were going to be, and I know many photographers who went bankrupt at that time because they made the investment in that and then it never paid off and they got left with very expensive machinery that was very quickly out of date. And I just wonder if, from what you're saying in this conversation, we've got the business side of things, we've got the Ponzi scheme side of things, we get that. We get why governments are feeling pressure to pass laws to to force us to give over everything to these people. And we get that. But from what you're saying, the photographer still exists. The photographer is still required.
Yeah, I think so. I think that from a messaging perspective, photography is about communication, isn't it? It's about putting a concept or a theme or a thought, or posing a query to an audience through that sort of visual language. And that's the skill set that we learn as photographers and image makers.
Mm.
And that is something that it's very difficult to sort of identify specifically what that skill set is. It's an understanding of the techniques that you use, the technical processes, but it's equally an understanding of visual codes. It's an understanding of cultural context and history, and psychology. All of that stuff sort of
And
rolled up.
empathy. This is,
Yeah, and
empathy.
empathy.
I mean,
Yeah.
that is the one thing that AI cannot replicate.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's devoid of any of that kind of stuff. I mean, empathy included, but also, cultural context, wisdom, etc., etc. All of that stuff is non-existent in that kind of stats-based pattern predictor. That form of autocorrect. So I do think that photographers are still a required role. I think there is a place in our culture for that, because my feeling is very much that, and I always have to be careful when I'm sort of trying to look at this from outside, because as you know, it's very easy to sort of find yourself in a bubble where you're kind of, you look at your LinkedIn feed and it's lots of people saying the same things that you are. And that's quite, whilst that's encouraging in a way, because you feel like you're sort of amongst your peers, and part of, your tribe is there. I'm very aware that actually there are loads and loads and loads of people who don't think and don't talk in that way at all. They have completely polar opposite views. But it does feel to me like a lot of people are resisting that sort of AI slop, as it's called, and I think that's a nice term to use, because of the lack of empathy, because of the lack of context, because of the lack of experience, that and the lack of human to human communication. You know, I think it was the Writers Guild in America. One of their leaders came up with the phrase that typing is not writing, which I think is a really interesting, succinct way of analyzing this. And that's absolutely right. Bashing a keyboard is not the same as creating a piece of text that has some meaning, and that communicates something to somebody else.
Maybe we could adopt looking is not seeing for
Yeah,
photography.
well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, people should be dusting off all the John Berger books they have, and kind of revisiting those for
Well,
sure.
they sit here above my desk. Um, so when we last spoke, we very much, I felt we kind of quite rigorous, but we came out of it quite positive at the end of it.
Yeah,
We felt that cheap usage photography, syndication usage photography around kind of stock was going to be in trouble, because that may well be, created by a company or somebody who just wanted a
yeah.
picture of two people shaking hands, even if they've got 14 fingers. Um, but now I'm getting a feeling from you that you're feeling even more positive about the impact on photography, but less perhaps positive about how government and laws are dealing with it. Am I right in?
Well, I think I'm still quite pessimistic about the impact on photography. I mean, I
Oh,
think,
okay.
yeah, I think there will be occasions where it can support what we are doing as image makers. And the other, as a side note to that, I think it's interesting to note and to flag up that a lot of tools and technology that we have been using for a long time in the digital realm are now being rebranded as AI, where previously they didn't have that particular nomenclature. And I think that's a marketing exercise. Marketeers must be sort of jumping up and down thinking this is great, we can have all of this stuff that previously, the clone and the heal tool, for example, that people are very familiar with if you use Photoshop or Lightroom or any of those kind of digital retouching platforms. That's now part of a suite of AI tools, which
Hmm.
is not nonsense, because they don't work in the same way. It's not predicated on a training data set. But that's an aside. I do think, I mean, I know from my own experience as well as a professional, I have lost two clients in the last year to generative AI, who have gone and used outputs instead of commissioning me. I noticed that I wasn't getting the work through from both clients. So I kind of was looking on their platforms to see what they were putting out. Noticed that there was still some content being generated, but that it looked a little odd. It looked a little plasticized, I think is the word I would use.
Mm.
So I just said, are you guys using generative AI? And they said, yep.
Okay.
We're doing that because we're not spending 5 grand a year with you. We're going to just spend a few $100s with a generative AI platform because it's good enough. And I
Well,
think,
this is what I was going to say to you is that, is this the shakedown? And I've had it through my career as a photographer that, there for me, there's always been a shakedown of clients
yeah,
in that, those clients that weren't willing to pay on time, or those clients that weren't willing to move with the times when it came to payment, I dropped out. They
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
there's a natural drop down. So is that the kind of client that you would expect to lose, with the idea of perhaps moving to a different client that
yes.
understood what you were bringing to them?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the problem with that, of course, is that there are going to be that's a smaller client pool
Mm.
for all of us to sort of to be targeting. So it becomes more competitive on that basis, which is that's inevitably going to have a knock-on effect on some people who are not going to be able to make a living at their chosen career, which is
But
a really
then,
sad.
yeah, but I think there's some positive in that. And I think that the positive in that is that if your photographic practice is based on technique that can be replicated, then you're in trouble. And I think we spoke about this before.
Mm,
Um, Whereas the pressure now, the responsibility for the photographer is actually to bring things that are outside of technique, but also cannot be replicated. And that is when we're talking about um, personality and empathy and all of those kinds of different
yeah,
things, which
yeah.
can't be learned on, dare I say, YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, those things are those sort of soft skills, I guess we're talking
Yeah,
about, which
yeah.
come with some people are going to be naturally better at than others, but they come with experience, they come with practice, they come with confidence, all of those kind of things. But also, I think it's the role of the photographer, is clearly much broader and less well defined. One might say an image maker is a better title for what people are doing these days because invariably it will include some form of maybe moving image as well as stills or a GIF generation or something else to do with, it's a multifaceted role, much more than it ever used to be. And I think perhaps and I think that's true for other roles within the creative sector as well,
Mm.
where there's more overlap and people are bringing other skill sets together. So there is a sort of a shift, I think, that we're in I don't know where we are in it, whether at the beginning of it or somewhere in the middle, perhaps, of those boundaries changing and the nature of what an image maker is being asked to do by their client is also shifting as well.
Yeah, I think so. But I actually think we're coming towards the end, actually.
Okay.
Well, only because I would trace it back to, I can remember the first time I got an Apple Mac was 1991, and that was to design magazines, which up until that point we'd done with knives and glue. The moment that that Apple Macs could be purchased,
Yeah.
DTP, desktop publishing, became a thing. And the whole magic and mysticism of these guys with knives and glue was kind of everybody suddenly thought they could do it. They could do a
Yes.
layout. And then if
Yes.
we progress into cameras and then that digitization, that democratization has been going on for at least 30 years, I would
That's
say.
true. I mean, I don't like the word democratization because it always feels like a loaded gun to me. It's kind of it's a way of saying you're going to not be able to make a living at what you're doing as easily as you had been before.
Well, yeah, but I always say anyone can take a photograph, but not anyone can be a photographer. Because if you're going to be a photographer, the one word, well, I think there are two things. One, you're a visual problem solver, and secondly, you have to provide consistency.
Yeah.
And those two things are really difficult. And
Yes.
if you add visual narrative to that, it's got even more difficult, which is why everyone thinks they can take one photograph or they can put it on Instagram and get a load of everybody likes my one photograph. You try doing that every week when you've got a
Yeah.
client on your shoulder.
Yes.
That's a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
So
I
I'm
think the
not.
other thing that's important as well in all of this is, and it goes back to what you said about empathy, is that ultimately I think people like working with people. They don't want necessarily to be spending their entire working creative career in front of a computer, looking at a screen, tweaking this, tweaking that. I mean, the whole point of 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 that kind of profession is that you are working with other people. It's so much of what people do as a creative practice is a collaborative practice, and I think you can't replicate that with something through an interface, that's a stats-based pattern predictor. It just doesn't fulfill the same needs. It doesn't carry the same heft. It doesn't deliver the same output.
So 12 months on from our last, or 12 months ish on from our last conversation, I thought that you were a bit more positive than you actually are. You're a bit more pessimistic. Um, so what's going to happen over the next 12 months? And we speak again in a year's time. What's our conversation going to be then, do you think?
I think well, a lot of I think for me, because of the where I sit within the industry, I mean, as you know, I've got a professional hat and an AOP hat that I wear, um, and because of the amount of work that the AOP have done in terms of responding to the government consultation on copyright and AI, which closed on the 25th of February. And thank you, by the way, to anybody here listening that was able to respond to that, because I know that they had 11,500 responses, which is the greatest number of responses to a government consultation ever. That's something. That says to me that there are a lot of people out there who are seriously concerned about the government's proposals to relax copyright law so that the tech sector can have free access to our creative works in order to build and train more generative AI platforms. So, in answer to your question, in 12 months' time, if the government has decided that they are going to press ahead with their preferred route, which was to do that, was to create an exception to copyright to allow for this, then I think a lot of people will be rethinking their career paths potentially. If, as we hope, the weight of pushback has been so great, and I think it has, I mean, you will have seen, I'm sure, a, a pretty rare sight on the morning of the closing of the consultation, where all of the press,
Mm.
the UK press, ran the same Make It Fair logo on their front pages. I can't think of any other occasion where that has happened aside from the end of a war, perhaps, or something like that. I mean, they tend to be fairly big occasions that unite the press in that
Well,
way.
I think finance, to be honest with you, because I think they suddenly realized, hang on,
Yes.
we're in enough trouble as it is, and this is going
Yeah.
to make it even harder for us. I hate to
Yeah.
be once again the cynical voice, but I think
No,
that's
you're
interesting.
right. It comes down to money always. Yeah, absolutely.
But also, okay, so if we look at photography as documentation, where does AI sit? Because the articles I've been reading about or written by evangelists of AI, and how wonderful it is as a creative concept. They're all sort of saying, well, yeah, well, photography used to be documentation, but it isn't that anymore. Well, I think that's where it should be. That's what it
Yeah.
can do that AI can't do. So
Yeah,
perhaps
totally.
my positivity is based in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the 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 generative AI technology is only able to operate on the basis of what it has been fed as training material. It has no connection to anything outside that. So it's a fixed set of resources, if you like, that it's using. Um, Whereas a photographer with a camera of some sort and access to the real world, who can go out and choose to engage with that in any way, shape, or form, is able to document what we see happening out there, and then bring that back, create some sort of narrative through it, hopefully embodied the kind of the themes and the conversation that they were wanting to start for their audience and present that. And that's something that generative AI on its own absolutely cannot do.
So there is a niche there for photography, Nick. We don't need to be too downhearted.
Oh yeah, niche. I mean, the trouble with a niche is that, by definition, it's a relatively small area within the context of the whole, isn't it? So you're not going to get many people in it.
No, but I do think that, and I've said for many years that photography got too big for itself.
Yeah,
When I first started back in the early 80s, there weren't that many photographers, because it was analog and physics and chemistry. Um, and then digital, sort of like everyone could be a photographer. And maybe now we're going back to a situation whereby it isn't quite so easy
yeah,
anymore, and there are going to be different skill sets. However, the idea of working with the visual image is still as relevant as it ever was. So, once again, I'm trying to be very kind of glass kind of half full here, because, and that's why I wanted to talk to you again to sort of get a bit of a, am I mad here? Am I
yeah.
seeing this right, or am I right? I don't know.
Well, I think, let's see what the government decide to do as a result of the consultation, because I think the way that they react or respond to the strength of feeling that has been demonstrated by the creative sector will inform how, in turn, we're going to start thinking about, our professional careers longer term, and whether indeed whether people feel that they've got a business or not, or whether they feel that they need to change direction and do something else. It's funny you mentioned glass half full, because you reminded me of something that I saw on LinkedIn a couple of weeks back, which was somebody had asked a generative AI platform to give them a picture of a glass full of wine and a clock on the wall in the background showing 6:30. And the output that was presented was a glass that was half full and a clock showing 10 past 10. And the, the point being is that as you will well know, and many other photographers listening, watching will know as well, that most of the time when you're required to photograph a clock, you set the hands at 10 past 10 because it's an aesthetically pleasing balance, etc., etc.
That's a
Likewise with the glass.
fantastically old school piece of knowledge.
Exactly. Yes, indeed. And likewise with a glass of wine, it's never going to be full to the brim. It's always going to be sort of half full or so. So the point being is that, the artificial and the intelligence part of that technology is remarkably stupid, because it can't interpret, it has no ability to understand the difference between 10 past 10 and 6:30. It sees a time and it just responds on the basis of what's statistically going to be the most likely outcome, which is going to be a 10 past 10 clock on the wall. And similarly, it's been fed the prompt for a full glass of wine, but clearly the number of pictures in its database that are full are very small comparative to the number of pictures where the glass is half full. So it will always give you a half full glass, which I think is a really interesting demonstration of its limits.
So it's not going to replace photography and it's not going to replace photographers, but some photographers are going to have to reconsider their client base, how they're approaching their client base, and the kind of work they're doing for that client base. Is that what you think?
Well, I mean, sadly, I think it will replace some photographers. I mean, as I say, I've lost two clients who have decided that, the good enough aspect of what they can get from a generative AI platform means that they can save, a four-figure sum and spend a tenth of that on sort of spitting something out that will do the job. It would be interesting to sort of maybe talk to them in a year's time to see if their sales figures have sort of maintained that kind of level that they'd hoped, or if, even if they're able to analyze that, that would be
Also, whether are they employing somebody to actually tap in the words? I mean, is this not a new job employment opportunity? Because
well, no, the the well-known sort of so-called prompt engineer, which I think was bandied about at the beginning of all of this, was, oh, don't worry, people can have jobs in that. No, I mean, as far as I know, this is just something that people are doing internally. Well, for the two examples that I know of,
It's
this is
probably
just
the accounts department, Nick.
indeed.
It's an accounts-based decision. It's not a
Yeah,
creative one. Which all
sadly.
well, well, that kind of raises a whole discussion again around the creative education within this country and the sophistication of people to make those decisions as to what is acceptable, because that's very relevant in this case, because if I go back to the world of DTP, they suddenly realized very quickly it was a lot harder than they realized.
Yeah,
Um, and you did need people who knew what they were
yeah.
doing.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, your experience as an art director will, compare that to how a lot of commissioning is carried out these days, where people are taking the responsibility for those roles with without those kind of skills that underpin those kinds of decision making.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I'm always saying that it's the photographer's job to educate the client.
yes, more so now. Yeah.
Yeah, which is mad, but just a fact. Listen, Nick, I've really enjoyed our conversation. I have to say, I don't think I'm a lot further forward, but I don't think but that's not your fault. I don't think any of us really are.
No, I mean it's still wait and see, I think, because there is still a lack of clarity about where people sit. I mean, that it's generally regarded that there is no copyright protection in any of the outputs. So I think a lot of clients and commissioners are very reluctant to go too far down that road where they're relying on something purely generative because of the fact that they can't control it. If there's no copyright protection vested in it, then it's impossible to litigate if somebody takes it and uses it for something else.
Mm.
I think people are waiting and seeing for some test cases, maybe for that. Interestingly, in the year since we spoke, there was a test case in the Czech Republic, which I know is, we're out of the EU, sadly, but will still have a bearing on UK court decision making, should it come to that. But the Czech case was an individual who had generated a piece of AI output. Somebody else had taken that output and used it for something different. And the person that had generated it in the first place filed a claim for copyright infringement. And the judge unceremoniously threw it out and said, there's no copyright in it. You can't make a claim. And that's a really interesting decision, because that kind of supports what we've been saying over the past sort of year, that there isn't any copyright protection within those kind of outputs themselves. I know that's painting a slightly binary picture, because as we've said already, there's a million shades of grey in between where you're starting to work on a piece of AI output and turn it into something else. And at some point, will there be copyright protection in it? Well, there probably would, because if you're putting your own creative input on top of or into something that's been created like that, it becomes a multifarious thing, doesn't it? It's not just a single type of piece of work.
Yeah, although the law is full of examples of people testing that over many, many years in art and music and all sorts of
Indeed.
creative areas. Nick, I think we should talk again in a year's time. What do you think?
So let's put a date in the diary, Grant.
I
Yes.
think we may need to. Listen, thanks so much for your input. And I do recommend that anybody watching this, you do check out AOP, which is the Association of Photographers, which Nick is very much involved with. You can join them. They are UK based. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
So just really for UK based photographers. But I
Well,
know
we
that.
do have overseas members, actually, Grant. I mean,
Oh,
that's an
okay.
interesting. People do. I think because people that are based overseas who maybe shoot for UK-based clients see the value in having a trade association that's based in the UK too.
Yeah. So check out AOP. Thanks, Nick. See you in a
Thanks,
year.
Grant. Yes, we'll do. Take care.